Ce que je dis en français, je vais le répéter en anglais et vice-versa, et on va pouvoir prendre vos questions dans la langue de votre choix, soit en anglais ou en français. Donc, tout d'abord, le contexte pour ce rapport, c'est le projet de brise-glace polaire a été lancé par le gouvernement il y a plusieurs années. Initialement, le gouvernement prévoyait acquérir un brise-glace polaire à un coût qui a été estimé pour la dernière fois en 2013 à un coût de 1,3 milliard de dollars. Depuis, le projet a été prolongé pour acquérir deux brise-glaces polaires. On appelle souvent ça des brise-glaces lourds, construits selon des spécifications du 21e siècle. Vancouver Shipyards a été choisi comme partenaire pour la construction du premier navire et le chantier Davie Canada va être probablement choisi pour construire le deuxième. Le gouvernement a aussi déclaré qu'au moins un des deux navires serait opérationnel d'ici 2030 et que le deuxième serait opérationnel d'ici 2031. Depuis l'estimation de 1,3 milliard de dollars pour un navire, le gouvernement n'a pas fourni de nouvelles estimations pour la construction des navires. So, the Polar Icebreaker project aims to acquire two ships, so two heavy icebreaker ships built to modern specifications. The initial project aimed at constructing or acquiring one ship, and the estimate, the most recent estimate to build and acquire that ship, dates back to 2013 and amounts to $1.3 billion. Vancouver Shipyards, was selected as the partner for the first vessel, and Chantier Davie Canada is the likely partner for the second vessel. The government has also stated that at least one of the two vessels should be operational by 2030, with the second operational a year later. There have been no updated current cost estimates from the government since the 2013 estimate of $1.3 billion for one ship. So that's why we are providing this estimate today. So what we did was to provide an independent estimate of the cost of acquiring two new polar icebreakers as opposed to one. We include all the costs associated with development and acquisition phases, and that includes project management, design, and construction costs. We also performed a sensitivity analysis to determine the financial impact of delaying delivery of the ships by 1 or 2 years. Donc, la portée du rapport aujourd'hui comprend une estimation indépendante des coûts liés à l'acquisition de deux nouveaux brise-glaces polaires. Et cette estimation comprend tous les coûts associés aux phases de développement et d'acquisition, c'est-à-dire la gestion du projet, la conception et la construction. On a aussi inclus une analyse de sensibilité pour déterminer l'impact d'un retard d'une année dans la livraison des navires et l'impact d'un retard de 2 années dans la livraison des navires. So methodology, we looked at the construction cost per ton for ships, for comparator ships, because there are no easily comparable ships of that same nature. We also looked at the light ship weight and the cost. We made adjustments to take into consideration the change over time and country differences where applicable, depending on our comparables. And we also allocated these costs over the assumed construction schedule. We also looked at other methods of estimations, and these confirm the estimate that we are presenting to you today. Donc, en termes de méthodologie, on a comparé le coût de construction par tonne pour des navires qui sont comparables en termes de poids et aussi de mission. On a multiplié évidemment le coût par le poids pour tenir compte de la taille des navires et rendre une estimation qui tient compte de la taille de ces navires. On a également fait des rajustements pour tenir compte des changements au fil du temps et des différences entre les pays lorsque nos comparateurs, nos navires comparateurs provenaient d'autres pays. Et on a réparti ces coûts, évidemment, en fonction du calendrier de construction présumé. On a aussi utilisé d'autres méthodologies pour confirmer l'estimation des coûts qu'on vous présente aujourd'hui. Donc, les échéanciers présumés, on présume que la gestion de projet, évidemment, a commencé déjà en 2010, on le sait, et on présume qu'elle va s'étendre jusqu'à 2031. La phase de conception a également commencé et on présume qu'elle va se prolonger jusqu'entre 2025 et 2030. Les points les plus importants, c'est qu'on présume que la construction du premier navire va commencer en 2023-24 et se terminer en 2029-30, alors que la construction du deuxième navire va commencer une année plus tard et se terminer également une année plus tard. With respect to assumed project timelines, project management has already started. It started in 2010. Project design has also started. It started in 2011 and will run well into the construction phase. More importantly, the first ship build is expected to begin in 2023-24 with completion in 2030. And the second ship construction should start 1 year later and be completed as expected 1 year later. So the results, which is what you've been waiting for, we estimate that for both ships, project management will amount to $346 million, design $820 million, acquisition $6.1 billion for both ships, leading to a total of $7.3 billion. And that, again, compares with an estimate in 2013 of $1.3 billion for one ship. Les résultats, ce que vous attendez probablement avec grande anticipation, on estime que la gestion du projet va coûter 346 millions de dollars, la conception 820 millions de dollars, l'acquisition 6,1 milliards de dollars, pour un coût total pour les deux navires de 7,3 milliards de dollars, comparativement au coût estimé par le gouvernement, la dernière estimation disponible, qui date de 2013, de 1,3 milliard de dollars pour un seul navire. Donc, les coûts sont significativement plus élevés, ce qui est pas surprenant étant donné que la plus récente estimation date de 2013 et comportait des coûts pour un seul navire. On a fait une analyse de sensibilité pour déterminer l'impact sur les coûts du projet de retard d'1 an. Donc, avec un retard d'1 an, on arrive à une estimation de coût qui s'accroît de 235 millions de dollars et un retard de 2 ans entraîne un dépassement de coût de 472 millions de dollars. We did a sensitivity analysis to determine the cost, the impact on costs of a 1 and 2 year delay, which is something that happens sometimes with big procurement projects. And we estimate that a 1 year delay in procuring these two ships would incur additional costs of $235 million, while a 2 year delay would increase costs by $472 million. That's the high-level summary of the report today. If you have questions, we'll be happy to take them. And you just need to follow Melissa's instructions. And I think she said raising your hands is probably the best way to ask a question, should you have any. C'est un survol assez rapide du rapport, du contenu du rapport. Si vous avez des questions, ça va nous faire plaisir d'y répondre en anglais ou en français. Et la méthode la plus simple de signaler votre intérêt à poser une question, c'est de lever votre main, d'utiliser la fonction dans Teams pour lever votre main. Et je vois que M. Bertillon a déjà une question. So, Lee, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, and thanks for the briefing today. I wanted to ask, just start with, kind of what the factors were behind this cost increase from the 1.3 billion from 2013 to now. Obviously, the addition of a second ship will drive up that cost, but I'm wondering the degree to which adding a second shipyard is a contributing factor to that. I thought I saw a reference in your report at 41.4%. I wanted to make sure I understood if the addition of a second shipyard meant that increased the already increased cost by another 41.4%. And what other factors? Was it delays? Was it just change in design? What other factors have contributed to this increase?
So thanks. The question is an interesting one. So we can't really speak to the $1.3 billion estimate as it dates from almost a decade ago. But obviously the time delay from 2013 to now is a significant contributing factor to explain the increase in cost, as is obviously the addition of a ship. So going from 1 to 2 ships and having an estimate that dates back to 2013. These are all factors. With respect to the 2 different shipyards, we estimate that this adds a cost of between $600 and $800 million to split the contract between 2 distinct shipyards. Because in naval construction projects, there are economies of scale and a learning factor that would be accrued should the contract be for to the same shipyard, which will not lead to these natural learning improvements when the contract is split. So that factor in and of itself contributes between $600 and $800 million to the cost.
And if I could ask just a follow-up, you've talked about, I assume, even though that adds cost, that will speed up delivery, as your graphs have indicated. I guess there's a cost benefit kind of the government has made here. But I'm wondering about the likelihood of, if you had any sense, the likelihood of these projects proceeding along those timelines that you have outlined, given, especially with Vancouver. Well, first of all, Chantier Davy still hasn't been, formally accepted as the third partner, and because Seaspan or Vancouver Shipyards has JSS, it still has OSS. What are the likelihood of these ships actually proceeding along those timelines?
Well, we have not estimated the likelihood of meeting these timelines because it's factors beyond our control. That's why we have provided sensitivity analysis. Should there be delays, that's the likely cost estimate. Should there be a 1-year delay and a 2-year delay, but we have not assessed the probability of these delays really occurring. I see Murray has a question. Murray Brewster.
Yes, good morning, and thank you for taking the question. I would hope you could expand a little bit on the notion of the roughly $600 to $800 million in additional costs because of splitting it between the shipyards. I recognize that there are first-of-class issues, but are there other factors that have gone into your calculation, and how precisely did you come up with that number?
So we did use comparators, multiple comparators for these ships. So similar ship size, different missions, same mission, different ship size. We combined these 2 estimates, taking into consideration different factors such as comparator ships, ships for which there is recent experience in Canada. And we looked at how much it would cost if it was the same shipyard, different shipyards, and that's how we arrived at that estimate. Chris here is one of the authors of the report, and I think he can probably shed more light or do it more intelligently and in a more articulate manner than I can.
Oh no, that was a fine answer. I would merely add that the components that go into the additional costs primarily are the additional costs of project management on the side of the government. Mr. Bertzian, by the way, that 41.4% concerns the governmental project management cost increase as a result of having to deal with 2 shipyards. And secondly, the loss of efficiency, the loss of economies of scale and learning that occurs as a result of using 2 shipyards instead of 1. Thanks.
And if I could just ask a supplementary question, in terms of, I know you folks normally will look at other projects elsewhere around the world. I'm wondering if you've got a clear sense as to how this project compares to what other countries are doing, and whether Canada is actually paying more for taking shipyard, the dual shipyard problem aside, but is Canada actually paying more per ship?
The difficulty in looking at what other countries are doing is that there are not that many countries with recent experience in building heavy polar icebreakers. So there's the Russians. Russians have polar icebreakers, but they're nuclear propelled, so it's not the same types, totally comparable ships. And the data that would be available is probably not as reliable and maybe not as available as we would have liked. So that's why it's difficult to assess whether Canada is paying significantly more by building these domestically or just paying much more than what normally would be required because of the comparator ships, the absence of easily comparable ships elsewhere for which we have data that is reliable.
Thank you.
I see another hand raised, Monsieur Berthiaume.
Sure, just a follow up since it didn't seem anyone else was going to ask a question. This is just the latest in a string of reports that your office has produced showing cost increases through the national shipbuilding strategy. I was hoping you could just offer some thoughts overall. I mean, I think Canadians, they've repeatedly been hearing about these cost increases. I mean, what does this say about the overall program in your view?
Well, it seems to clearly signal that building ships in Canada is more expensive than initially thought, especially if we look at cost estimates that are earlier in the planning stage. And it also suggests that there is a significant premium being applied whenever we build ships, and I'm not talking about polar icebreakers specifically, but whenever we build ships domestically, there seems to be a premium paid. So parliamentarians would probably benefit from having a sober second thought as to whether procuring these ships abroad would entail significant savings and whether these savings would be sufficient to offset the lost benefit to having a made in Canada fleet of ships, whether it be for surface combatants or other types of ships that the government is procuring. Because obviously, some of these ships are being purchased at a significant premium compared to what would be available if we bought off the shelf when it's possible from other suppliers.
And just as a follow-up, I'm trying to remember, go back through your reports, whether you've looked at that premium in particular, and whether, kind of a step back from that, you think there has been sufficient debate around this. We almost seem to be successive governments have been beholden to the idea of build in Canada. And I'm curious as to whether you think there's been enough debate around the pros and cons of all of this.
So we haven't looked at that specific premium because it can be difficult to precisely is maybe not, but to accurately determine the cost, because if we buy off the shelf, but then we Canadianize to a large extent, so there could be debate as to whether the cost estimates from buying off the shelf abroad would be accurate, but it is clear that there is a premium. And as to whether there has been sufficient debate by parliamentarians on that, I leave that up to parliamentarians to determine whether they want to revisit that issue or whether they have debated that enough. It's a question that's eminently political because there are regional benefits that need to be taken into account, and there's also the issue of national security when it comes to maintaining the capacity to build these types of ships domestically, which is very hard to quantify, obviously.
Thank you very much.
D'autres questions? Other questions? Going once? Going twice? Okay, so if you have any other questions, you know how to reach us, where and how to reach us, and we'll be pleased to do our best to answer these questions. Si vous avez des questions subséquemment, vous savez comment et où nous joindre. Ça va nous faire plaisir de répondre à vos questions. Merci beaucoup.